Why do museums not just give their stuff back? Short answer, because it's illegal. Long answer, we're going to need a little bit more context. In the 18th and 19th centuries, British troops would often steal, pillage and loot valuable objects from countries around Africa, Asia and more in order to punish countries for not taking trade deals with Britain that often led to absolute economic dependency on Britain as the sole trading partner of that country. When countries refused, objects were stolen, which would then be sold off into the collections of museums like the British Museum here, which would then fund further violence and campaigns into these countries to establish colonial rule. We know these items were stolen. It's well documented by contemporary sources, and yet museums like this one are still filled up with them. However, they can't get rid of them because it's illegal. There are a couple of different laws in question, but the main ones are the British Museum Act of 1963, the Heritage Act of 1983, and the Museum and Galleries Act of 1992. These laws affect a number of different museums, including the British Museum, the V&A, the National Gallery, and many, many others. I've put a full list of all the affected museums and galleries on screen now. These acts forbid museums of disposing of objects except for three very specific circumstances. If the museum has an exact duplicate of the item is damaged beyond repair, or it is deemed no longer within the area of public interest. Museums can also transfer the objects to other museums or galleries within the same jurisdiction, but that does mean that those objects cannot leave the UK. There is, however, a workaround for these laws. Objects can go on loan, but this is far from permanent, with loans often being 3 years, with then a further review period of extending it for another 3 years. Not every museum in the UK is bound by these laws. In fact, the Horniman Museum in South London recently returned its collections of Benin bronzes to Nigeria. However, the largest collection of those bronzes are still right here in the British Museum, which is bound by the law, so they cannot be returned. Those in favour of the Acts argue that the conservation that we have in British museums is the best in the world, and that they worry that if artefacts went to other countries, that conservation would not be as upheld. And they also worry that if we remove these artefacts from museums, that they would go into private collections and not be able to be seen by the public. But this means that museums from all over the world who have amazing conservation but aren't located in the UK are left out of being able to look after these artefacts. When faced with greater scrutiny to return these objects to their countries of origins during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, the Boris Johnson government came up with the policy of retain and explain, keeping hold of the artefacts, not changing the law, but adding informational plaques next to them to explain how they were acquired. This policy of retain and explain has been carried over by our current Labour government under Keir Starmer. A government spokesperson has been quoted saying there is currently no plan to permit a change to the law that would allow objects to return home when asked about the Parthenon marbles being returned to Greece in 2024. Critics of the Acts argue that this is a moral issue, and that most of these artefacts have spiritual and political significance in their countries of origins. And they also argue it would be an incredible boost to the tourism sector of those countries when the objects go on display. Dr. Tristram Hunt, director of the V&A, has said it should be up to trustees of museums, not the government, what should and should not be in a museum's collection. And as of 2022, the Green Party manifesto has a pledge to repeal the 1963 British Museums Act and other acts that force these objects to be held in the UK, being the only major political party to do so. It looks, unfortunately, like a change to the law is very, very unlikely in the short term. So, for the time being, museums can't give their stuff back, because our government made that illegal.